I also worked my way through college. But when I graduated, there was never a day where I thought somebody else, some single mom working 2 jobs, ought to pay that loan back instead of me. I paid those loans back. And most Americans have done that. About 13% of the American people take out student loans. Yet for some reason, the president decided that he thinks all Americans, 100% of American taxpayers, should pay the student loans of the 13% that don't want to pay them back. Is that fair? Does anybody think that's fair to all of those people who are working hard, barely getting by in a tough economy? And so what we do is we actually start those loan payments back. That's $60 billion in savings just this year, in the first year, so that people don't have to carry the burden for something that somebody else said they would do. This is America. We make our choices. If you want to take out a loan, you should have that ability. But you shouldn't then expect somebody else to go pay it for you. Let's get back to the values that made this country so great. We put real permitting reforms in place, something we haven't seen in decades. Anybody that's trying to build anything in America, if you're trying to build a factory, if you're trying to maybe add on to your farm, if you've got a barn and you want to add on to it, they find a puddle in the back and under waters of the U.S., next thing you know, you got 5 different federal agencies where groups are suing to stop you from getting that permit, even though you've done everything right, you followed all the rules. So we finally fixed that. We create a one-stop shop so that if you're trying to get a permit, if you're playing by the rules, somebody else can't go game the system to try to kill your project by going to one agency and you spend 2 years fighting that lawsuit, you win that one, the next day they file another lawsuit with another agency and another, and next thing you know, it's 10 years later and you just give up and walk away. It happens all the time in America. By having a one-stop shop, but we also put shot clocks on the unelected bureaucrats. Because you know what, Mr. Speaker, if a federal agency tells you that you have to get them some information back, they don't say, hey, get it to us whenever you want it. They give you a deadline, and it's usually pretty soon. And if you don't meet that deadline, you don't get your permit. But if you get them all the information, you might wait 6 months, a year, or longer to hear back from the federal agency. These are people that work for the taxpayers of America. Shouldn't they have the same requirements and a shot clock on them that they put on you, the American people paying their salaries? That's in this bill. And finally, Mr. Speaker, real work requirements. I don't think there's ever been a time in America where there are more jobs that are open, people looking for workers. You can go to a restaurant if you want to take your family out for a nice dinner, and you're seeing a third of the tables empty, yet they're not seating anybody because they don't have enough workers. Why is that? Because the federal government is paying millions of people right now not to work. Think about that. In America, where everybody's looking for workers, the federal government is borrowing money from countries like China to pay people not to work. This is insanity. And for all the people out there that are working, they're paying that freight. Why don't we say for people who are able-bodied, who are able to get back into the workforce, there's a social safety net for people who run on hard times. But if you just choose to sit at home and turn down jobs, that's your prerogative as American. Don't ask somebody who's working 2 jobs to pay for you to sit at home and turn down work. And by putting work requirements back in place, something Joe Biden himself voted for as a senator, you also strengthen Social Security and Medicare, 2 programs that are going bust under President Biden's runaway spending that we shore up in this bill, actually strengthening those programs that are so important to the people who paid in for it. There's more work to be done, absolutely. And we will get to work tomorrow working on the next round of things we need to do to keep getting this country back on track. But we never get there if we don't start with the first step. That's what we're doing here tonight. That's why we need to get this bill passed and then go work on the next reforms we've got to do to continue strengthening this great nation, the United States of America. I urge passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The distinguished majority leader failed to mention that we raised the national debt 3 times during Donald Trump's presidency. He failed to point out that $8.7 trillion was added to the national debt during Donald Trump's presidency. With that, let me yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman, a productive member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Pasquarelli.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the only problem is our tax system is broken, and you don't want to talk about it. We made strides to fix this problem with an historic IRS investment. The IRS is coming after you. I saw those commercials. You're better than that, guys and gals. You're better than that. No one's putting an army together. But we want to make sure everybody pays their fair share. What in God's name is wrong with that? And that's what we're talking about. And if you look at the IRS estimates of those people who are getting away with murder, that's what the average American knows about, thinks about, but does little talking about, because he figures he can't do anything about it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
Gentleman's recognized.
30 seconds.
So, Article 1 is ignored many times by both parties, both sides of the aisle. It is the Congress that has the power to put a budget together. It's pretty simple. All Americans must understand what is happening here. President Biden put forward a budget to boost opportunity for working Americans, increase access to health care, and
Gentleman's time has expired.
tax fairness. And, Mr. Chairman, in the greatest country in the world, if we don't fix our tax
Gentleman's
system,
time has expired.
we have not done our job as Congress folks. Thank you, and I yield back.
As a reminder, members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. Does the gentleman reserve?
Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Democrats often say that the new IRS funding will only be used to go after the wealthy. This is simply not the case. I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a CBO blog post from 2021 examining the Biden administration's $80 billion proposal and stating that it would return the audit rates to the levels of about 10 years ago and that rate would rise for all taxpayers. Our calculations show that this would mean 600,000 more audits per year for taxpayers making less than $75,000 a year.
Without objection.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I come from a town called Butler, Pennsylvania, and in that area, it's Pennsylvania's 16th congressional district. In that district, the average annual income for a family of 4 is about $52,000. Now, down here, people laugh and say, nobody can live on $52,000 a year. I said, in my district, they do. In my district, they do. But let's talk about this in kitchen table economics. Last year, we had about $4.9 trillion in revenue. We spent $6.2 trillion. Kitchen table economics is that you tell that family that earned $49,000, go out and spend $62,000, and they look at you like there's something wrong with your head. And they say, you can't do that. I said, your government does. Your government does. They do it every year, and they do it with your tax dollars. Listen, this is America's wake-up call. This isn't about the blue side of the house or the red side of the house. Look up in the gallery. That's red, white, and blue. That is America. Those are the people that pay our taxes. All we're asking tonight is we look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act. What a weird name to be used in Washington. I wish we could stop playing this game of who struck John. Both parties have spent too much money for far too long. Tonight's the night to turn this ship around. This is the USS Abraham Lincoln, and it takes more than one person at the wheel. We've all got to grab that wheel, and we've got to start pulling on that wheel to turn this ship around.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I appreciate the time, but I got to tell you, tonight's a wake-up call, America. Not a Republican wake-up call or a Democrat wake-up call, but an American wake-up call. Please, wake up.
Does the gentleman reserve?
Reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you. They're applauding for me, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, with that, I'd like to recognize the distinguished gentleman, member of the Ways and Means Committee from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend President Biden, Leader Jefferson, all of our negotiators for the great work they've done to keep us from defaulting on our debts. This agreement protects critical funding for children and families, and especially am I pleased with the protections for homeless youth in school, foster children who've aged out of care, and veterans in need of health services. It protects Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. This bill protects historic investments in clean energy. It also protects the 40 million student loan borrowers under President Biden's student loan relief plan, and it provides relief for some of my concerns about SNAP and work benefits and work requirements in TANF. I still have some serious concerns about how it affects the environment and responds to climate control issues. The bill is not everything I wanted, but it does give us an opportunity to pay our debt and protect the good work we've done during the first term of President Biden.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and yield back.
Is the gentleman reserved?
We continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, the Budget Chairman, Mr. Arrington.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have repeatedly warned, the fiscal state of our nation is in decline, our financial health is rapidly deteriorating, and our national debt is unsustainable. And by the way, both parties bear some blame. But one thing is for sure, Mr. Speaker, we didn't get here overnight, and we won't get out of this mess with just one piece of legislation. Here's my admonition to my colleagues. This can't just be a one-off deal. It must be the beginning of a movement to restore fiscal sanity in our nation's capital. We must end the era of big government funded on the backs of our children and change the culture in Washington to continuously and repeatedly rein in our out-of-control deficit spending. But today, there's only one deal on the table and only one question for me and my colleagues to answer. Do the biggest cuts to the wasteful and bloated bureaucracy, record rescissions of federal funds, and reforms to welfare and environmental regulations constitute a meaningful step in the right direction? Mr. Speaker, the answer is unequivocally yes. As I've said all along, we will pay our bills, we will protect the good faith and credit of the United States, but we will not give politicians a blank check to bankrupt our country. The American people gave Republicans the majority in the House to stop our Democrat colleagues' unbridled spending and reverse Biden's failed economic policies, and I believe the Fiscal Responsibility Act is certainly a good start, which is why I support this piece of legislation, and I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Is the gentleman reserve?
Reserve.
Gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Alabama, a very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, Ms. Sewell, for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the bipartisan budget agreement in order to protect Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security while also preventing a devastating default on our debt. To be clear, this bill is far from perfect, but it prevents a default. It prevents future efforts to hold this nation hostage for the rest of the 118th Congress, and it prevents cruel Republican cuts. This budget agreement that President Biden negotiated funding for education, health care, veterans benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security Most importantly, it prevents Republicans from forcing a devastating default that would kill countless jobs in my district and destroy our economy. Mr. Speaker, I join in expressing my frustration with the crisis that my Republican colleagues have manufactured. The American people deserve better than a Republican majority that chooses to govern crisis by crisis. Let's lift this debt ceiling and get on with the people's business in the people's house. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
We continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. How could I not support a bill that claws back billions in unspent COVID funds, a bill that cuts trillions in Biden's out-of-control spending, a bill that caps spending levels for years to come, and a bill that enacts work requirements to bring more Americans back into the workforce, lift households out of poverty by connecting them with the best anti-poverty job program, a good job. And most importantly, this bill begins. It's a start to put our nation on a better fiscal trajectory. Our debt to GDP today is at the highest level ever since the end of World War II. If we do nothing to curb spending, our federal debt will be double our GDP by 2050. This is a start to change our trajectory. Now, I wish I could be voting for more than this. I liked our original bill a heck of a lot better. But fact is, the president and the Democrats who control the Senate fought hard to maintain their spending addiction. Given that we only control the House, I'm very pleased with all that is in this bill. It's most definitely an improvement over existing law, and I'm disappointed that some of my colleagues don't see that. This bill will give our creditors the confidence that we can govern by putting us on a better path. It's a step in the right direction, and I'm proud to support it.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There isn't anybody in this chamber who believes that Republicans will abide by a cap on defense spending in the next year. Let me yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Congresswoman Delbene, a champion of the child tax credit.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bipartisan budget agreement. This deal will protect American families and our economy from a devastating default on our nation's bills in just 5 days. It will also shield our veterans, seniors, law enforcement, and schools from the worst of the extreme demands my Republican colleagues issued while holding our economy hostage. This deal is far from perfect, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good when the stakes are this high. A default would mean an immediate recession, millions of jobs lost, devastating retirement accounts, and higher borrowing costs for Americans. Compromise means that no one gets everything they want. So we have a choice between a catastrophic outcome or a chance to move forward with a bipartisan compromise. The worst outcome here would be a default. So let's get this done and over to the Senate so we can take default off the table. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Malliotakis.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the Rolling Stones said, you can't always get what you want, you get what you need. And we need to avert a default that would stop checks to our seniors, benefits for our veterans, hurt the U.S. dollar, and Americans' retirement savings. We also need to change the fiscal trajectory of our nation, and this bill does both by reducing inflationary spending for the first time in over a decade with the largest savings in history, imposing spending caps and adding checks and balances on the executive branch. We started from a place where the President and the Senate refused to negotiate, and we ended with conservative wins. That includes stopping Biden's plan to hire additional IRS agents this year, clawing back unused COVID funds, expanding work requirements to reduce dependency on public benefits, and cutting costly red tape that slows down critical infrastructure projects. While no deal is perfect, this is only the beginning, and we cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Republicans under the leadership of Speaker McCarthy have restored balance to government. We've put an end to the Democrats' massive inflationary spending sprees, and we will continue to fight for the American taxpayers as we proceed in this process to stop reckless policies that fuel inflation. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
The House will come to order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for order.
Will members take their conversations off the floor? The House will come to order. Thank you. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A very capable woman, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, is the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Congresswoman Moore, for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you so much. Republicans claim that they just had to threaten the economic well-being of every American man, woman, and child because of the $31 trillion debt was too high. Well, hypocrisy thou hast to name, GOP, because what they insisted on, their red line, was not financial at all. It was to double down on the so-called work requirements. Thank God the White House negotiations pushed back on the worst of these changes in TANF that would have saved $6 million over 10 years. No, speaker after speaker has insisted on denying food to poor, old women who are primarily black and brown. You know, it seems like the pound of flesh that you get is more delicious than having savings. But just wait. Before the ink is dry on this bill, you will be pushing for $3.5 trillion in business tax cuts. Watch my word. You heard it here first. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
Continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman very much. Mr. Speaker, while the Fiscal Responsibility Act is not perfect, and God knows we need serious corrections, but there are at least 10 conservative American provisions in this bill that will benefit our economy and advance a higher level of fiscal responsibility. And let's be honest, this is the most conservative bill that can pass with a Biden White House and a Schumer Senate. The Fiscal Responsibility Act stops the excessive spending, stops the bleeding, and adds to our workforce with work requirements. It includes the most important federal environmental permitting reforms in 40 years. And don't take my word for it. This is coming from the Associated General Contractors of America, the Petroleum Institute, the Marcellus Shale Coalition, and the National Association of Manufacturers. Virtually every small business association, every group committed to sound fiscal policy, such as Americans for Tax Reform and Americans for Prosperity, have endorsed this legislation. This bill reins in the Biden administration's executive order spending, which accounted for over $1 trillion in spending over the last 2 years. There's also a reduction of the IRS of $20 billion, protect Social Security, and all the while we will avoid a catastrophic default. I urge support of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri continues to reserve.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Congressman Kildee, whose voice and health have been returned.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my friend, the ranking member, for that. Look, paying America's bills isn't an option. Defaulting on our debt would have a consequence for every single American, and in fact would have global consequences. It would increase every family's costs, eliminate millions of jobs, threaten the retirement security of seniors and families all across this country. Let me be clear, we shouldn't be in this position. We shouldn't be close to default. It's a manufactured crisis. The House Republican majority created this crisis because they didn't have the will to submit their ideas to the legislative process, rather holding us all hostage to exact this price, to exact this legislation, when we could have simply gone through the legislative process of making decisions about the priorities for this country. They have the majority on the Appropriations Committee, on the Ways and Means Committee, on the Budget Committee. They ought not fear the argument over these issues. We need to make sure that we accept the fact that we've come to a compromise that protects Medicare, Medicaid, protects the American people from catastrophic default. I urge my colleagues to support
Gentleman's
this
time has
legislation.
expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time in my 15 years in Congress that I've voted to increase the debt limit. I do so today because this measure places real constraints on future spending, more than $2 trillion. That makes this bill the most important victory for fiscal conservatism in more than a decade. The debt is but a symptom of the central problem: reckless spending. Once we've spent $1, there are only 3 ways to pay for it: taxes, inflation, or debt. It's the spending stupid. We've got a long way to go, but until the American people have had enough and replaced the President and the Senate majority, this is a remarkable step forward. And the many pro-growth provisions in the bill provide the most potent antidote to debt: economic expansion. Defeating this bill would create a financial and political panic that will quickly forfeit the many hard-won reforms that are in this bill. We cannot let that happen.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized. I yield 1 minute to the very capable gentleman from Virginia, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Beyer. Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this imperfect bill. Look, I would much rather have voted for a clean debt limit increase, as we did 3 times under the previous president. And I do believe it's profoundly wrong. The Republicans chose to hold our economy hostage, using the American people as leverage to demand concessions, and it was unnecessary. We're in a divided House. They have all the leverage they need to negotiate this through the regular appropriations process. You know, our values sometimes overlap, but they don't here when they want to protect the wealthiest tax cheats, and we just want everyone to pay their fair share. Look, President Biden and his negotiating team worked skillfully and successfully to prevent a majority of the draconian tax cuts. This bill could have been so much worse, but it would be a catastrophe if we didn't pass it. I will vote yes, and I continue to urge my colleagues to permanently abolish the debt ceiling, which could cause a real disaster someday soon if we don't get rid of it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts
Continue
reserve, Mr. Speaker. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler.
Gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to voice my support for the Fiscal Responsibility Act. As I have said from the very beginning, we must negotiate, we must cut spending, and we cannot default. The FRA reduces discretionary spending for the first time in decades and is the largest deficit reduction in our nation's history. It cuts non-defense and non-veteran spending to below 2022 levels, one of the primary goals of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. It saves taxpayers $2.1 trillion over the next 6 years while blocking $5 trillion in new taxes proposed by the Biden administration. The bill also caps spending at 1% growth over the next 6 years. In the process, House Republicans will have the opportunity to reduce spending even more. That will help us take on the Biden administration's reckless spending head-on, crack down on record inflation, and get our economy on the right track. This bill also protects Social Security, Medicare, and veterans' benefits, despite previous false claims by my Democratic colleagues that we were going to cut those vital programs. It enacts critical permitting and NEPA reform, enacts safeguards on executive spending, and forces Congress to engage in a functional appropriations process. The bottom line is this: with a divided government, no party is going to get 100% of what it wants. We all have a responsibility to govern, and default is not an option. The Fiscal Responsibility Act puts us on the path to fiscal sanity, protects our commitments to veterans and seniors, and raises the debt ceiling so we will not default.
Time has expired.
That's a bill we should all support, and I will vote aye.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to the very capable gentleman from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Congressman Evans.
Mr. Speaker, gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is far from perfect. However, the full faith and credit of the United States is at risk, and we cannot let Republicans drive us to default. Defaulting on the national debt would disrupt Social Security benefits for 92,000 households in my congressional district. I will not stand by and let harm come to our nation, seniors and people disabled. I urge my colleagues not to draw out this debt crisis and instead return to our focus of lowering the cost for working families. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
I'm sorry?
I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, we have a breakdown of the time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 10 minutes. The gentleman from Missouri has 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to another very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
For how much time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
1 minute.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bipartisan budget agreement and President Biden's work to ensure the nation pays our bills and avoids catastrophic, self-inflicted economic crisis. This legislation protects the many bipartisan achievements realized in the last Congress, such as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and PACT Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act with its historic investments in addressing climate change. With this vote, we will protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and prevent devastating cuts sought to life-sustaining SNAP and TANF programs. With this vote, we will keep America moving forward to meet the challenges ahead of us. Compromise requires give and take, and both sides make difficult concessions to achieve this agreement. This is the result of bipartisan deal-making, and I look forward to holding up the President's side of this bargain. I hope this is a learning moment and we can avoid future political brinksmanship. I urge all my colleagues to put the American people over politics and support this important bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts
Thank
is
you,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute again to a very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from California, Congressman Panetta, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the bipartisan budget agreement to raise the debt ceiling. Because if we don't, we will devastate the global markets and undermine the faith of the world's most important financial system, the United States of America. I support a clean raising of the debt ceiling, but elections have consequences. And my colleagues on the other side wanted to use their leverage for concessions. And so, in a divided government, governing means compromise, and it gets us this bill. Legislation that would, would raise the debt ceiling until 2025. 2, the bill would stop the drastic cuts desired by the Republicans, and it would protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And although it limits SNAP for certain ages, it expands those types of benefits for veterans and our homeless. And finally, we protect the historic legislation that we passed last Congress to invest in our infrastructure, our manufacturing, reduce our drug costs, and care for veterans. And part of this bill even furthers our transition to clean energy. So I will vote for this bill, but we have a lot more to do if we want to get serious about reducing our debt and deficit. But that only begins when we stop governing by crisis and start governing by leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts continues to reserve. Gentleman from Missouri.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of my district, most important energy district in the country, and on behalf of American energy independence, and on behalf of all Americans who are searching for a reasonable solution to a looming crisis. There are approximately right now 229 major fossil fuel projects in the United States currently awaiting permit approval. A recent study found that $157 billion in energy investment was stuck in the NEPA pipeline, and that simply a 2-year NEPA deadline would spur $67 billion in energy investment. Killing energy projects by the bureaucratic red tape nightmare and the slow walking that we've seen is unacceptable. No more. I'm extremely proud of the energy reforms, the NEPA reforms, the EPA reforms in this bill, the first in over 40 years, which will speed up over 200 projects to lower costs for consumers and protect our national security. No, this bill is not perfect, and arguably it shouldn't be. A divided government yields compromise, and it slows the heavy hand of government. But saving $2 trillion, lifting families out of poverty, and defunding IRS agents is worth it. Vote yes for America's energy independence.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts. Mr. Speaker, I want to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, an alum of the Ways and Means Committee, Congresswoman Plaskett. Gentlelady from the Virgin Islands recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through Democrats' leadership, Democrats have protected our hard-earned and historic economic recovery. That team secured an agreement that prevents Republicans from forcing devastating default and rejects their most extreme cuts in the GOP Default in America bill. President Biden's agreement protected Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans' health care. This was a negotiation with individuals whose prime priority was cutting food assistance and protecting the wealthy, and that was their main priority across the entire negotiation. Fiscal responsibility, their only responsibility was to protect their tax cuts for ultra-wealthy that grew the debt to $7 trillion in the first place. The president successfully insisted that this agreement was going to include time limits on SNAP. It needed to include meaningful improvements to SNAP. Republicans protected the wealthy at the feet of the neediest Americans.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
Democrats understand the needs of the American people and our most vulnerable Americans, as well as the full faith and credit of the American people.
Gentlelady's no longer recognized. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleagues that because of the Republican Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the bottom 20% of earners saw their average federal tax rate fall to its lowest level in 40 years. Low and middle income families of four saved at least $2,000 on their tax bill each year. I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri continues reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me recognize the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, the ranking member on the Agricultural Committee, Mr. Scott, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Recognized.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a most historic night.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House will be in order. Gentleman needs to be heard.
Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, I want to thank President Biden. President Biden invited me, along with the other leaders, ranking member and chairman of our Agriculture Committee. And it gave me a chance to talk straight to the president about the serious food shortage that's coming to our veterans. Right now, when I told him, and many of you may not know this, but the veterans are living in more insecure food households than anybody else, a 7.4% higher than the general public. And when I told President Biden that, he said, we got to do something about it. And that's when he moved with his energy to be able to take not only the veterans, but SNAP and others off of SNAP work requirements.
Gentleman's time's expired.
God bless this president for his leadership.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair will remind members that they need to remove their conversations from the floor. The speakers deserve to be heard. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized. Let me recognize the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mervyn, for 1 minute. Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ran for Congress to solve problems, and this legislation averts a crisis. A default would jeopardize millions of people with unemployment, increase credit ratings or increase interest rates, and risk retirees and devastate their 401ks. A default would also jeopardize numerous investments in the American worker in the 117th Congress, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This bill not only created jobs, but it also, with a strong Buy American provision, strengthened our domestic steel and manufacturing base, and it also allows for our members, our veterans, to be protected and puts funds dedicated to the health benefits and provides resources for the Toxic Exposure Fund. I appreciate the dedicated work of the administration and the Democratic colleagues. For my neighbor Gretchen, who had anxiety about her 401k, this bill supports the American worker, it supports the American industry, the steel industry, and it also
Gentleman's time's expired.
protects the American dream. I'm voting yes.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts
Mr. Speaker,
is
could I
recognized.
inquire as to how much time?
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 5 minutes remaining.
Okay.
Gentleman from Missouri has 2.5 minutes.
We're waiting on one speaker, and I'd like to move this along, depending on what the chairman's position is.
Prepared to close. We're prepared to
After
close.
you're prepared to close?
Yes.
Not here. We're prepared to close.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for closing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that this has been an elevating conversation about how we arrived here tonight. Our colleagues on the other side, they voted for the infrastructure bill, they voted for the CHIPS Act, they voted for the CARES Act, they voted for the defense spending increases, and they voted for a tax cut in 2017 that borrowed $2.3 trillion that was added to the national debt. Now, for those who might be paying attention tonight, the national debt is the cumulative effect of deficits. These were annual deficits that were run up. Neither party is responsible for the pandemic. On March 11th of 2020, we were warned what was coming. 20 million jobs evaporated. Tonight, in some measure because of the leadership of Joe Biden, every one of those jobs has been returned, and 9.5 million jobs go unanswered. In this negotiation, which means you don't get everything you want, there are some quality moments that we take great credit for. We defended Social Security, despite the fact there were 3 Republican senators who proposed cuts to Social Security. That's the reality. We defended Medicare. We defended Medicaid, and we defended veterans' benefits. And very proud of the fact that we wrote the Pandemic Relief Act. There's a group here tonight, I've been here long enough to know this, they were against this before they were against it. They were against it years ago. Never mind tonight. But this moment of bringing the nation to default, what this does, or what it would do to the American dollar as the currency of choice for the world, what this would do in treasury markets for liquidity purposes, what this would do to the hard-earned 401k plans of the American family, to take us to this moment in this showdown that we had. This argument tonight was never about perfection. All 435 members of this House would probably have written a different version of this bill. But in divided government, that's not reality. Now, the last point I want to make is this. In coming days after this righteous debate about balancing the budget, our Republican colleagues are about to offer a massive tax cut. We need to be ready because of the fiscal rectitude that they have offered on this floor tonight. So the corresponding responsibility of all of us is to point out what they intend to do with another tax cut. 201, $1.3 trillion. And by the way, with 2 wars and 2 million more veterans that we need to support. Now, the other reality is back in 2003, another $1 trillion of tax cuts. And the worst one of all, that tax cut in December of 2017, where they borrowed $2.3 trillion for a tax cut that went to the wealthiest among us and had very meager economic growth. So this debate tonight was a good and spirited one because we also have, I think, found a common purpose in passing this legislation. But let's engage this debate going forward. If we want the things that we say they want, we're going to have to pay for them. And that means at some point revisiting these tax cuts that have been put on the table in an arbitrary fashion and, as I noted, with borrowed money. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
You know, Mr. Speaker, we hear the other side of the aisle over and over talk about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Well, let me tell you about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Last year, we had record revenue into the United States of $4.9 trillion, which was $900 billion plus more than what Joint Tax and CBO predicted what would happen upon passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act delivered for a family of four who makes less than $60,000 a year that they pay zero in federal taxes.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House will be in order. Members will remove their conversations from the floor. The gentleman deserves to be heard. The gentleman is recognized.
But, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about tax cuts. The other side passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act, and it was tax cuts for their wealthy donors. In fact, the CBO just came out with a new score saying that it cost over $700 billion. But guess what? 90% of your tax credits go to corporations with more than $1 billion in revenues. And it goes to $125 billion to China. That is what your tax cuts did. After years of Washington running in the wrong direction, we have an opportunity to take meaningful steps in the right direction on addressing America's debt crisis. The American people deserve nothing less. They see what inflation caused by reckless spending of the Democrat Party has done to their family budgets, to their retirement security, and to their small business plans. We have the opportunity to end the constant doling out of tax dollars under the guise of COVID relief. We have the opportunity to downsize the $80 billion pay raise that was given to the IRS last year. The IRS does not need a raise. It needs a reckoning. We have the opportunity to support those who can work, to find work and climb out of poverty. We have the opportunity to put some guardrails on the administration so if they are going to spend tax dollars by executive fiat, they have to find savings somewhere else. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to address our debt crisis as we address the debt ceiling. Yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri yields back his balance of his time. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Resolution 456. The previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. Question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Provide for a responsible increase to the debt ceiling.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Aye. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Without objection. Purpose is the gentleman. Gentleman from Massachusetts asked for a recorded vote. Those in favor of a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on passage of the bill will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2797. This is a 15-minute vote. yeas are 314. The nays are 117. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2797 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
H.R. 2797, a bill to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to require certification examinations for accredited investors and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. Vote the yeas are 383, the nays are 18. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
One minute. Microphone test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is a microphone test. Rayburn Room. Thank you.
Oh, we should.
Move this behind me?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
You got your folder? I got my folder.
All right.
Tiny folder. This is official folder.
First of all, thank you all for being here. Before I begin, I just want to start by saying how grateful I am to Garrett Graves and Patrick McHenry. They had given their time and talents to this effort for more than a month. We would not be here without them. Our entire conference and country owes them a great deal of debt for what they put themselves through. I want to thank our conference. You know, on February 1st, I got my first meeting with the president.
I've been thinking about this day before my vote for Speaker, because I knew the debt ceiling was coming. I wanted to make history. I wanted to do something no other Congress has done, that we would literally turn the ship, that for the first time in quite some time, we'd spend less than we spent the year before. Tonight, we all made history, because this is the biggest cut and savings this Congress has ever voted for. And it's not that we're just voting for it. This is going to be law. $2.1 trillion. You've all covered this entire battle. You were there on February 1st when I walked out after talking to the President. And I was kind of hopeful, because he told me in that meeting we would meet again. He sat next to me at the prayer breakfast the next morning. He told the entire crowd that we would meet again. But for 97 days, he said no. People look at me and say, why are you always an optimist? Because I know, as an American, tomorrow will be better than today. I had to be an optimist, that every day I woke up and said, maybe today the president would change his mind. Maybe today he'd want to put the country first. Maybe today he'd want to meet. But he never did. Not until our entire conference passed a bill. The Senate never did. They took no action. The Democrats' plan was to do a discharge petition to only raise the debt ceiling, and we'd have no savings. We'd take us further off the cliff. But when I finally got to meet with the president, we couldn't talk about the entire budget. We couldn't talk about and look at places that we could have savings. We could only focus on 11% of the budget. But in that 11%, not only did we give you the greatest savings in American history, there's going to be people who are on welfare today that will no longer be on welfare, that they will find a job because of the work requirement. And not just when they find that job, their self-worth, their attitudes are going to change. They're going to believe in themselves. They're going to be able to buy a house, send their kids to college because of the vote we took tonight. Because of the vote we took tonight, the largest rescissions in American history. All the COVID money, the billions of dollars sitting out there that they said they would never bring back. You know what? To the taxpayer, to you hard-working Americans, we stood for you. We brought that money back. For those who are afraid that they're going to get audited because the president wants to have 87,000 new IRS agents, right now he has 0. We took every single dollar they were going to hire somebody this year away. And I promise you, I'll be back next year and next year and next year. Because I believe government should be here to help you, not go after you. We didn't just take the money from this year, we took another $20 billion. I think we should get some more border agents with that $20 billion. I think that's where America would want to see us go. We capped the ability of growth, of spending in government for the next 6 years. We're holding people accountable to do the work you're supposed to do as a member. Otherwise, cuts across the board. We are unshackling what holds America back for competition with other countries. For the first time in 40 years, we changed the environmental review process. So you don't have to wait 7 years on average to build a road. You could do it in 1 or 2. So it's not just the bridges, it's not just the roads, it's the energy projects that will make us energy independent. We stopped $400 million going from the CDC Global Health Fund, not to Americans, but taking Americans' money to send it to China. I believe in looking after America first. More than 2/3 of our conference voted for it. We got all the Democrats who signed a discharge petition to say they would never raise the debt ceiling, only raise it clean. We got them to vote for it too. So think about how much further we can go. I didn't stand far from this room after a couple, 3 days of trying to get elected Speaker. And every question you gave me, what could we survive? What could we even do? I told you then, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. Each week, we have stood up for the American public. Be it its strongest border security, be it a parent's Bill of Rights so you can have a say in your kids' education, be it ending the pandemic or standing up against those who are weak on crime to make our streets safer. Tonight, I hope we proved it to you again, that we put the citizens of America first. And we didn't do it by taking the easy way. We didn't do it by the ways that people did it in the past by just lifting it. We decided that you had to spend less, and we achieved that goal. Is it everything I wanted? No. But sitting with one House, with a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic President who didn't want to meet with us, I think we did pretty dang good for the American public. My last question, my last statement to everyone in America, I will never give up on you. It wasn't an easy fight. I had people on both sides upset. But I was focused on you. And I will stay focused on you because I'm waking up tomorrow going after everything we didn't get here today. This is an extraordinary team that helped us. Our Majority Leader, Steve Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nobody said it would be easy to break Washington's out-of-control spending pattern. It's been going on for decades. If you look at the spending curve, just how much money every year Washington has been spending more than it takes in. And for years and years, people would say somewhere it's got to start where they turn the ship, where they start righting the ship, where we finally start cutting spending. Yet it never happened. Republican, Democrat administrations failed, and tonight we took the first step. A bill that actually cuts real dollar spending next year compared to what it was this year. That's an important, critical first start. It's just the beginning. This is by far not the end. It is the beginning of changing the pattern of spending in Washington. And make no mistake, if Nancy Pelosi was still Speaker and the Democrats were in charge, we wouldn't be having a conversation about how much we cut. The conversation would be about how much more did Washington vote to spend? How many more taxes did Joe Biden put on the hardworking families of America? Because that's what President Biden wanted to do. He made it crystal clear, not just to Speaker McCarthy, but he actually talked about it publicly. He wanted more taxes, even though he's passed over $1 trillion in new taxes, and that tax and spend burden over the last 2 years is one of the reasons why families are struggling today, why inflation is running, skyrocketing out of control today. It wasn't until Speaker McCarthy said, that day is over, no taxes, in fact, no new spending. We're finally going to start negotiating about how much to cut, how much to save for the American people, how much can we finally get our country turned around and start growing the economy. And this bill contains components of all of those elements. Spending. If you look at some of the important factors, just cutting over $1 billion in the IRS, President Biden wanted to more than double the agency. And CBO confirmed it was going to be going after lower-income families. People that are single mom working 2 jobs was going to be paying more. And we finally started to reverse that trend. Real work requirements. You want to talk about something that's going to help change the culture of this country. Getting people back to work at a time when everybody's looking for workers. You know, people think it's psychotic that the federal government is borrowing money from countries like China to pay people not to work at a time when everyone's looking for workers. And not only do these work requirements help restore the dignity of work, but these work requirements will help strengthen programs like Social Security and Medicare that are so vital to us. and so important to those people who earned those benefits. Yet when President Biden started paying millions of more people to sit on the sidelines, to turn down work and still get over $35,000 a year in benefits, they're not paying into Social Security. They're not paying into Medicare. That's one of the reasons why those programs are going towards bankruptcy under President Biden. We reverse that trend by strengthening important programs like Social Security and Medicare. A lot of other important provisions in this bill, but again, this is the first step. This is a down payment on the other things that we're going to start doing, but none of those things would be possible if we didn't start tonight in the action that was taken by this House in this majority. With that, I want to yield to somebody who's been working overtime to make sure that all of our members from every swath of our conference have been able to talk about the important components of this bill all around the country over these last few weeks. Our conference chair, Elise Stefanik.
Thank you, Steve. Today is truly a historic day. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is a win for the American people and future generations. I know that as the newest mom in Congress, when I think of my son, Sam, when I think about the babies born in this country today, we are standing up for them. I also want to thank Speaker Kevin McCarthy for his extraordinary leadership, this entire team, Patrick and Garrett for leading the negotiations, and the dedicated and disciplined teamwork of our House Republican Conference to successfully communicate our message and deliver this result for the American people. The Fiscal Responsibility Act will be the largest deficit reduction in history. It will restore fiscal sanity, and it will hold Washington accountable. Despite being consistently and constantly underestimated by the mainstream media, week after week since the start of this Republican Congress. But week after week, day after day, House Republicans will work tirelessly for you, the American people. We will continue to provide policy solutions and successfully communicate around these critical issues to strengthen our economy. And we won this public narrative with the support of the American people. Between President Biden and Speaker McCarthy, House Republicans won from start to finish. The passage of this legislation is a testament to House Republicans delivering on our commitment to America, an economy that's strong. I look forward to the Senate passing this bill, and again, I thank Speaker McCarthy and the entire conference for their teamwork and leadership to deliver this result. I'm now honored to turn it over to one of our chief vote counters, our Chief Deputy Whip, and I want to also thank our Whip, Tom Emmer, for their incredible work throughout this process, my good friend from Pennsylvania, Guy Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stefanik. You know, we got to remember where we were when we started. Everybody said that the Democrats would not negotiate, that Biden would not negotiate, that there had to be a clean debt ceiling increase. And we were told that Republicans would never have the votes to lift a debt ceiling. And we passed Limit, Save, Grow with Republican votes. We did that despite everybody saying we wouldn't. And then we came back, we got Kevin McCarthy in the room, we got Garrett Graves in the room, Patrick McHenry to negotiate. And we were told again that Republicans would not have the votes to get this done. And tonight, we passed this with over two-thirds of our conference voting for this act. And we knew we had to do two things. Of course, we had to lift the debt limit. We had to avoid financial disaster, but we also had to have real spending reforms. And this is the largest deficit reduction we've had in history. So I couldn't be more proud of Whip Tom Emmer, our entire Whip team, Speaker McCarthy, and the two negotiators that we had in the room, Garrett Graves and Chairman McHenry. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my good friend, Chairman McHenry.
Hey, thanks, John. Thank you. Well, first of all, it was an honor to negotiate on behalf of House Republicans and Speaker McCarthy. That was a true honor. And it was a real privilege to work with Garrett Graves of Louisiana, who's become a very dear friend of mine and a trusted confidant. It was tough. It's a tough negotiation. It didn't please everyone. Go ask anybody in the halls, right? It's divided government, so our expectations have to be right on what we can achieve in divided government. But even in divided government, we brought a fiscally conservative package to the House of Representatives, commensurate with the House Republicans' demands that we pare down spending, commensurate with the command of the Speaker that we spend less money next year than we spent this year. And we delivered on that. It's $2 trillion of savings. And what that means for the taxpayer is it lightens their burden. to pay higher taxes in the future for the debt we're accruing today. We have work requirements, and we think the value of work is important for American society, and we give people that opportunity and connect it with the social safety net. And we balance that, making sure that we are careful about the homeless population and veterans and those right out of foster care. We're very thoughtful about that. And finally, with permitting reform, with environmental law changes, we're going to see energy production here in America that will happen more quickly. We're going to see projects happen like roads and bridges and buildings happen more cheaply and a whole lot faster. So there's a good package. And this is a down payment on what conservative governance can look like in Washington, D.C. But in a divided Washington, it's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction for the conservative philosophy that I hold and the outcomes that I seek and House Republicans seek. But I want to thank Speaker McCarthy. Without his focus and effort, without building consensus among House Republicans and being able to deliver on a bill that raised the debt ceiling, we wouldn't have been at the negotiating table. So we had a lot of folks that wanted to make the perfect the enemy of the good. This was quite a good package. I'm proud of the work we were able to put forward, and I'm proud that this bill can become law. And it was a real honor to work with my good friend, one of the most intelligent, focused members of Congress, and one of the worst practical jokers that I've ever met, my good friend, Garrett Graves.
Thanks, Patrick. Wow, what a year it's been. Y'all remember in January, you're sitting here looking at one of the thinnest majorities in modern history. You're watching a bumpy January start. And you, along with everybody else around the country, was sitting there thinking, this is going to be a dysfunctional Congress. But I'll tell you, there's one person who's standing behind me who said this isn't going to be a dysfunctional Congress, this is going to be a transformational Congress. And with one of the thinnest majorities in modern history, look at what's happened in this House of Representatives, how this speaker's been able to unite members of this conference with diverse ideology, being able to pull people together and passing legislation which transforms how we deal with energy in the United States, helping to lower prices, helping to lower emissions, helping to sever our dependence upon foreign countries for energy. We have a crisis on our southern border with millions of citizens of other countries illegally crossing into our nation, bringing fentanyl that's killing our own citizens, enriching cartels, human trafficking, and this speaker brought a diverse group of people together, and we passed border security. We passed American security legislation. We had a Parents' Bill of Rights that was passed with strong support. We had a bill that was signed into law that prevented a lessening of punishments for crime. We had a bill that was signed into law that ended the COVID emergency. And today, one of the most historic pieces of legislation that has ever passed the House of Representatives. A bill that will save the American people over $2 trillion. A bill that helps to restore the appropriate balance of powers as envisioned by our founders, that ensures a role of Congress, that ensures that you don't have a tyrant, a dictator, a monarchy that's out there waving a wand, deciding that hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer funds are going to be spent without any approval or consideration by their representatives in the United States Congress. Legislation that builds upon work requirements, that benefits both those that pay taxes and those that are dependent upon our social welfare safety net, because it has been proven that this helps get people back into the workforce. Look, I could go on and on about all the benefits of this legislation, but I'll tell you what has happened today by this Congress that is going to be signed into law. This is one of the most significant pieces of legislation that's ever passed, and I'll say it again. With a bumpy start and many people with incredibly low expectations, we've once again passed transformational legislation, and as the speaker said, it's just the first step. The man behind me is one of the best strategists I've ever seen in my life. And what you saw today, the legislation that passed with over 300 votes, hitting high water marks in categories no one ever expected, anticipated, or ever before achieved. Wouldn't have happened without him, wouldn't have happened without the vision, the leadership, the persistence, and the optimism. Thank you.
I do want to say there's one person that's not here right now that deserves a lot of credit, and that's our whip, Tom Emmer. He's done an amazing job. So, want to take some questions? Yeah, you're excited.
So in the bill, there's the CR provision. Why does it?
No, there's not a CR. What it says, this is not an automatic CR. It says, for too long, I'm frustrated how this place works. People didn't have to show up for work. You couldn't be in this building. We would have to pass 1,000-page bills with no one having opportunity to read it. I hope you understand that has all changed. But what we would do is, in the past, the Democrats would wait and they'd throw an Omni, do all the work they had done all year, and they'd throw it with about $1.4 trillion at us right before Christmas, told you had to pass it, or you couldn't go home. You couldn't read it, you got shoved at you. No more Omnis, no more business that way. This place has changed. This was a 99-page bill. I'll get to the answer. You had 72 hours to read it. The majority, 15 pages, were just rescissions, things that we are taking back. What this does, by January 1st, encourages this body to pass all 12 appropriation bills. Don't give us an Omni. Do the job you're elected to do. And if not, a 1% cut across the board. I think it'll encourage him to do the job. Yes.
What would happen between October 1st and January 1st?
You would have to pass some type of CR during that time period. Yes.
This was an overwhelming bipartisan vote. But does it say something that more Democrats voted for this bill than Republicans? Do you have any regrets about cheaper and deeper spending cuts that could have got some of the conservative members?
Really? Okay, so let's see. Deeper spending cuts. Non-defense spending, you take vets out, is lower than it was in 2022. What we just proved was Democrats were here and they spent $6 trillion. They brought us inflation, everything else. They said only thing they would do is just raise the debt limit. Well, now they voted for work requirements. Now they just voted to put PAYGO on on all of our president, that he can't go create a new regulation or others without cutting before that. They now just capped spending for 1% for the next 6 years. I can think of all sorts of more bills I'm going to bring to the floor because they just said now they'd vote for it. I'm not sure I heard everything, but this is what I heard the question. You tell me if I'm wrong. What does it mean to not give up on the American people? That President Biden said, I kept my word? Okay. And what do I see going forward? When I talk about the American people, I talk about we're not going to stop until we make your streets safe. We're not going to stop until we make sure the border is secure. We're not going to stop until we get the rest of the IRS agents repealed. We are not going to stop until we put ourselves on a path that a new child born in America is not given a $95,000 bill. We're going to put ourselves, we're going to make our economy stronger. We're going to make our streets safer. We're going to give you more freedom where government gets out of your life. And we're not going to stop until we make this happen. Yes, sir. Now, let's be serious how we got here. You say it's a unique coalition. It's a coalition of a Republican Congress with 5-seat majority leading. The president would have never even met with us. He denied meeting with us for 100 days until we passed something and the Senate did nothing. The House Democrats said they'd never vote for anything until the president came down and told them this was their deal. They weren't in the room. So that's a unique coalition, that we pass a bill, you negotiate around our bill, and the Democrats in the day join us to vote for it. I'll take that every day of the week. Yes, ma'am.
While the majority passed this with the majority, you still had more Democrats voting in favor of this than Republicans. Chairman McHenry told me earlier that those in
Look, every day I could wake up and improve. There's so many times I stumble as we go. It's difficult in a time of negotiations to keep your full conference abreast, because as we do, you all leak it and you can't negotiate once you leak, and so something blows something else up. Maybe if we were in session when we were closing down to the end, maybe so. I don't think we were ever going to get anybody. I mean, we have people who didn't vote for Limit, Save, Grow. Ken Buck didn't vote for that. Andy Biggs didn't vote for that. I don't think they've ever voted for a debt ceiling. Matt Gaetz has never voted for it. So we're never going to get everybody. But we have spent 4 months bringing everybody together. And whether you voted for or voted against it, you wanted something more, right? I can only look at what's on the bill. If I'm going to say this doesn't have something I want, I'd vote no against every bill. But history will write, this is the largest cut in American history. It's not even close. And there's a number of people who voted against it that had voted for debt ceilings in the past that just raised them. So maybe I could have explained it better. Maybe I could have been a little out front but I'll improve each day. It wasn't an easy task. The president not willing to meet with us, so there's probably a lot of different things we do better. Yes, ma'am.
You said that Democrats got nothing in this bill. They got more votes. So how do you define them getting nothing? They got more votes than Republicans.
Well, I think they voted for it because they wanted to stick up for their president, but if you think they got work requirements, I'll bring them more work requirements. If you think they like the idea of having $2 trillion in cuts, I'm coming back tomorrow with more cuts. If you think they like the idea that we can change environmental review, I'm bringing more of that back because I didn't get everything I want. If you think the Democrats like repealing $21 billion from the IRS agents that they want to try to hire sometimes and they hired none, I'm bringing back the next $60 billion to them. So this is great. I think it's wonderful that they voted for it because they are now on record. So they can't sit there and yell, this isn't good. So I'll bring something back tomorrow. Let's get the rest of the IRS agents. Let's get the rest of the work requirements. Let's cut more because we are in a big debt. This is fabulous. This is one of the best nights I've ever been here. I thought it would be hard. I thought it'd be almost impossible just to get to 218. Now I found there's a whole new day here. We've woken them up. Maybe they listen to our speeches. I don't know. Yes, ma'am. Two-thirds.
Yeah, two-thirds.
Over two-thirds, but just to be fair.
Do you think that this should kind of quiet the rumblings from the House Freedom Caucus members up in Washington?
It's up to them. Yes.
So, in the past several days, obviously, some members of your conference have been very vocal about their issues with this bill. Some of them violated promises you made to them in January. What is your response to that?
Well, first you have to tell me what promise I violated. Did I say I would cut the biggest spending cut in American history? I don't even think I said that, but I probably surpassed my promise. If you think I would say we'd get back to 2022, if you take the non-defense veterans out, it's actually lower than 2022. If I said we'd get some work requirements, we got some work requirements. If we said we would cap it, spending, we got 6 years of that. So I'm not sure which promise I could make that I couldn't keep. Oh, yes. Yes, ma'am. Well, we've got a number of things we've got to do, but we've got to do appropriations. We've got a lot of oversight work to do. I don't know if you followed FBI Director Wray not following through on our subpoena. Now says he would let us look at the document. I think there's a lot of problems out there. There's a lot more in spending. I don't think the FBI deserves a building the size of the Pentagon and some Taj Mahal to spend almost $1 billion in. I think there's a better way to spend that money. I think there's a lot of places we can look that we can find savings. I see the border that's still not secure. We passed a bill over to the Senate. So we got an appropriation process. There's a lot of ways that we can get legislation in there at the same time. We're going to work each and every day. Every day I'm going to wake up, try to improve from the day before, and keep my eye on what the American people want us to do. Yes. Look, there's a number of things. Well, the first thing I would say, you've got to secure the border before you do immigration reform. And we tried hard to make some of that in here. We tried hard to be able to even reform further that we could become energy independent. And we committed that we'd continue those discussions, that we couldn't get it all in here. But we've got to lower the cost of energy for all Americans. We could become energy independent, but we can help the world, and we can lower global emissions around the world. If we simply replaced Russian natural gas in Europe for 1 year, we would lower CO2 emissions by more than 218 million tons. 218 million tons in 1 year. It would create more American jobs. It would make our economy stronger. We need to expand our grid. Garrett has to be an expert in that. And we did forge good relationships. I will tell you, the individuals from Shalanda Young to Rachetti, I have the utmost respect for them. They are bright. They are tough negotiators. They represented in a professional manner the whole time. And you've got to understand, this was not easy. This negotiation blew up a number of times, where I wasn't sure at times we weren't going to get somewhere. There were times that one side would say to the other, we need to give up. Maybe we have to have somebody else different in the room, that maybe we're not doing something that you're not seeing the way we're seeing it. But the one thing that happened is that we didn't give up, that we believed we could find a place. I know the country is divided. I watched Congress divided today. I watched my own Congress, my own conference. I will work to make sure everybody comes back. It might not be easy, but it's too important to let go. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, it sounds like we won't be doing this again until 2025. What a shame there. But in the meantime, what's your message to voters as they look back on this moment? You call it a historic moment in preparation for the next presidential election.
Okay, well, this is what I will say. It doesn't mean we're going to wait just for the next debt ceiling to come. I didn't want to wait till the end days to do this. That's why I went down to see the president February 1st. But we're not going to solve our debt problem by trying to do it during a debt ceiling. I'm putting a commission together as Speaker of Republicans and Democrats. America has done this before. We did it right after World War II. We put a committee together of Republicans and Democrats that looked at any place that they had duplication. It was the last time we had hit debt at 102% of our GDP. And they did it together. And when they found duplication that they could eliminate, they brought it directly to the floor. No amendments, vote it up or vote it down. We can't keep doing the same thing to solve the problem. We have to think differently. And we can't do it with just one party. We are all in this together. And I'm going to encourage the Democratic leader to nominate and appoint the people who will be serious. And when I worked with Hakeem when we did the China Select Committee, that's what we got. And we were able to work together on this. So that's what I'm coming back with tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. Well, I'm not convinced yet that whether I use people on the outside or just use members of Congress themselves. I'm not sure I want to wait for a bill to pass the House and get stuck in the Senate. The Senate doesn't do much. So I happen to be Speaker. Why don't we just create it? Let's not wait. Let's do things. We don't need to keep studying. We don't need to keep waiting. The American people are tired of that. This is a new House under new direction with a new focus. The focus on them. Yes.
I'm just following up on another question. If the Senate passes amendments to this bill, is the House prepared to take up amended bill from the Senate? Senate Republicans said that they want to offer amendments.
They can offer amendments. I'm not quite sure they'll pass, but we'll take that up as it goes. Look, the House is here when they weren't supposed to be in session. I know many of them are going home. We'll do whatever needs to be done, but I doubt that it'll come back.
And then can I ask on your relationship with President Biden? How has that changed over this series of negotiations? Obviously, you said negotiating for the White House didn't here. You had multiple meetings with the President himself. How has this changed your relationship with him?
He hasn't invited me to dinner or lunch yet, so. Look, I respect anybody in the office. It's not an easy office to win. I understand what they're under. I just hope he doesn't sit back and ignore people when they want to work with you. I enjoyed working with his team. I enjoyed meeting with him. We're wide apart in a philosophy. We're wide apart in the direction we want America to go. We have a much different understanding when it comes to revenue and expenditures. He has increased spending so much in America. It is the highest level we have ever spent in this country, while at the same time we have the most money ever coming into this country with the largest debt we ever had. It is not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. And all the president wants to do is keep raising taxes. We should take this moment in time in our history to have the highest revenue to be paying down debt, not spending more. We have a clear difference there. I respect him, I'll debate him, but I'll work with him if we can lower the debt. Yes, ma'am.
Speaker, when we talk about the Senate taking this up later this week, you're and your team have really taken the lead on these negotiations with the White House. The Senate wasn't really involved in them. You guys hashed out the deal. So how is this working now when it moves to the Senate? We have some Republican senators saying they'll stall the bill. Are you working with your Senate counterparts to encourage them to vote in favor of this deal and get it signed into law?
Look, everybody gets elected on their own. I think the Senate sat back and they didn't produce anything. Ideally, it would have been great had we produced something as we did and they produced something. We could have gone to conference. Unfortunately, they decided that no, just wait to the deadline and rush everything through. We think Congress should act differently. We should be more responsible. We should be reasonable. We should be sensible. And that's exactly what we did. So I'm sure they can pass the bill. We just sent them one, and it's going to be law.
Did you speak to former President Trump about this bill? And if so, what did he say about it?
No, I speak to President Trump, but we didn't talk much about the bill. So we don't want to end on that question. Let's end on something else. What are you going to do now when I walk out of my office? Are you still going to be there? All right. I might miss you one day, but remember this. I'll still look forward when you come back. And you know what? You still ask the same questions each week. Do you think you can pass the bill this week? Do you think you'll still be Speaker next week? Keep underestimating us, and we'll keep proving the American public that we're never giving up on you. Thank you and good night.
你下载中天新网 App 了吗？我想和您分享一个下载中天新网 App 很重要的理由。台湾言论自由有中天才完整，请立刻下载中天新网 App， 和我们一起守护台湾。多一个下载，就多一份力量。